My name is Amber Sullivan, and at 29, I was still a disappointment to my family. I sat at our Thanksgiving dinner in Lubbock, Texas, a small, foolish part of me, still hoping for a crumb of recognition. My father, Robert, raised his glass. To Ethan, he boomed, "The future of this family and Aegis dynamics." Then my mother's voice, dripping with a pity that cut deeper than any insult, sliced through the air. "And Amber, when are you going to quit that little army game and get a real job?" The air was stolen from my lungs as I sat there, a ghost at my own family's table. They had no idea that my little game was a $1.2 billion national security project. Their project. It's a uniquely painful feeling, isn't it? That moment you realize you're invisible to the people who are supposed to see you best. If you know that feeling, I'd be honored to read your story in the comments. Because that night, I made a silent vow. It was the last time they would ever make me feel that way. And the story of how I kept that vow is what you're about to hear. The long drive to Lubbock had been a familiar ritual of self-deception. As my Ford F-150 ate up the miles of flat Texas highway, under a sky so vast it felt like infinity, I let myself hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this time they'd see me. I walked through the front door, and the warm, rich scent of roasting turkey, sage, and cinnamon hit me first. It was the smell of home, a comforting lie. The warmth stopped at the door. My mother, Carol, was in the dining room, her back to me as she meticulously arranged the silverware. She glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, Amber, you made it. Was the flight bumpy?" She didn't wait for an answer, turning her attention back to a fork that was a millimeter out of place. In the living room, my father sat in his worn leather armchair, a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. The low roar of the Dallas Cowboys game filled the space between us. He gave me a single perfunctory nod, his eyes never leaving the screen. No hug, no welcome home, kiddo. Nothing. I felt like a piece of furniture they'd forgotten they owned, a ghost haunting the edges of their brightly lit lives. The dinner table was a masterpiece of Southern hospitality, laden with a glistening turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, bright cranberry sauce, and my mother's famous pecan pie cooling on the sideboard. But every bite I tried to take felt like swallowing gravel. Ethan, my brother, held court. He spoke loudly about Q4 projections and leveraging assets, dropping business jargon like he was scattering jewels for the less fortunate. He recounted his latest success with Project Cerberus, the name a bitter irony on my tongue. "That's my boy," my father beamed, his chest swelling with pride. "Always at the top of the game." My mother then turned her smile, a tight, practiced thing to me. "And how is your gig work, dear? Still at the same base?" The question was an empty box, offered only to be checked off a list of maternal duties. Before I could form a reply, Ethan leaned forward with a smirk. "Speaking of the game, sis, do you even know what EBITDA means?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Nah, probably not. They don't use that stuff where you are." A wave of polite, complicit laughter rippled around the table. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it was sharp, and it lanced straight through me. I could feel my own heartbeat, a dull, painful thud in my ears. The final blow came with the toast. My father stood, his glass held high. "To Ethan," he declared, his voice echoing with authority, "the rightful heir to the Sullivan legacy at Aegis, and to a future where our family name continues to command respect in the Texas business world." He spoke as if I didn't exist, as if his only child was the son sitting beside him. He sat down to applause from my aunt and uncle. In that quiet moment, my mother leaned toward me, her voice a conspiratorial whisper meant to sound like comfort. "Amber, your father just wants what's best for you. You should have listened to him all those years ago." The blame, the casual crushing weight of her blame, was worse than the outright disdain. It wasn't anger I felt then. It was a terrifying cold clarity, a decision, forged in the fires of years of silent slights, settled deep in my bones. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at my plate, the food now a blur. They would pay for this, not with anger or with tears. They would pay for it with the one thing they truly understood: consequences. The decision hung in the air, a silent cold weight in the aftermath of the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. I simply excused myself and walked up the familiar creaking stairs to my childhood bedroom. The vow I had made downstairs wasn't born of a single insult. It was the final, cracking sound of a foundation that had been eroding for years. To understand the steel in that decision, you have to walk through the museum of my past. My room was exactly as my mother had preserved it, a shrine to the daughter they had wanted me to be. Trophies for cheerleading and academic decathlons gathered dust on the shelves. Faded ribbons from track meets hung beside framed honor roll certificates. It was a museum of a ghost, of a girl who had tried her best to fit their mold. My eyes drifted to a blank space on the wall, a pale rectangle where the wallpaper was a slightly lighter shade. That space was reserved for a ghost of a different kind. I remembered the day I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. The pride I felt was a physical thing, a warmth spreading through my chest as the polished gold bar was pinned to my uniform. I'd sent the 8/10 photograph home, imagining it taking its place on the wall. A few weeks later, I called my mother, my voice bubbling with excitement. "Oh, honey, I got it," she'd said, her voice distracted. "It's just, the wall is so full, and Ethan's new management certificate is rather large. I'm not sure where to put it." The next time I came home, I found it. My commissioning photo, the proudest moment of my young life, wasn't on the wall. It was stuffed in my father's desk drawer, curled at the edges, tucked beneath a stack of old utility bills. Meanwhile, Ethan's certificate, celebrating a low-level promotion, hung in a heavy Texas oak frame with a gleaming brass plate, given the place of honor right above the fireplace. The memories kept coming, each one a fresh layer on an old wound. I was in Afghanistan, the air thick with the taste of dust and fear. The sickening shriek of incoming rockets had sent us scrambling for the concrete bunkers, the percussive whoomp of the impacts shaking the very ground beneath us. When the all-clear was finally given, my hands were still trembling as I found a satellite phone to call home. I just needed to hear a familiar voice, to feel a connection to a world where things didn't explode. My father answered. "Amber?" he'd said, his voice sharp with impatience. "I'm in the middle of something with the Japanese partners. Is it an emergency?" Before I could even say that I was okay, that I was alive, he'd continued. "If not, call back later." The line went dead. I learned a few days later from an aunt's email that his emergency meeting had been a celebratory golf game at the country club, honoring a new contract Ethan had landed. I could have died in that bunker, a world away, and my existence would have been an inconvenience to his tea time. But the loneliest I ever felt wasn't in a war zone. It was on a perfectly manicured parade ground at Fort Gordon, Georgia. It was the day I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, a significant achievement at my age. The ceremony was formal, filled with the crisp formations and solemn traditions I had come to love. I had sent the invitations home a month in advance, but when the time came, I stood on that field, scanning the crowd, and saw only the 2 empty chairs where my family was supposed to be. They were stark, empty voids in a sea of proud, smiling faces. That evening, a storm rolled in, the Georgia sky weeping as if for me. I stood in the downpour, my phone glowing in my hand, reading the email from my mother. "So sorry we couldn't make it, sweetie," it read. "The whole family had to fly down to Florida. Ethan is receiving the Employee of the Year award, and his company paid for the whole trip. We just couldn't miss it." I stood there, drenched and hollow, the silver oak leaf on my shoulder, feeling impossibly heavy. I had won battles, led soldiers, and earned the respect of my command, but I had lost the one war I never knew how to fight, the war for a place in my own family's heart. It was in that moment of absolute desolation that I remembered the words of an old army chaplain. He had once told me, during a moment of private despair, "Amber, God doesn't give us a burden without the strength to carry it. Your trials are not your punishment, they are your forge." Back in my childhood room, the ghosts of the past swirled around me. The pain was real, a living thing. My eyes, tired of looking at the past, finally settled on the present. In the corner of the room, hanging from the back of the door, was a simple black garment bag. It wasn't a relic from the museum, it was my armor. It was my future. And inside it was the person they were about to meet. The armor hanging in that black garment bag wasn't given to me. It was forged. It was forged in the lonely, sweltering humidity of a Georgia sunrise, long before my family had any idea what I was truly doing. My father thought I was playing a game. The truth is, I was remaking myself from the ground up, fueled by a determination that tasted like ash in my mouth. My journey began at Fort Gordon, the nerve center of the Army's Cyber Command, and my life there was a relentless loop of brutal discipline. The alarm on my government-issue phone would scream at 4:30, no snooze button allowed. By 4:45, I was out on the pavement, my boots pounding a steady rhythm as I ran my 5 miles. The air was thick and heavy, even before the sun had fully risen, clinging to my skin like a wet blanket. Breakfast was black coffee and a bowl of plain oatmeal, eaten while reviewing threat intelligence reports from the night before. My days were a deep dive into an ocean of complex code, hunting for the digital fingerprints of hostile nations, trying to breach our networks. My brain was a machine that never shut down, constantly analyzing, predicting, and fortifying. While other junior officers went to the local bars in Augusta for a beer and a break, I was back in my small barracks room, the glow of my laptop screen painting my face blue as I worked through online courses in advanced cryptography and network theory. I had no social life. I had a mission. I had to be twice as good, twice as smart, just to prove I wasn't the failure my father had already decided I was. Then came my first real test. I was tasked with leading a small team to build a simulated defense system, a digital fortress to train other cyber warriors. For 3 months, I lived and breathed that project. I skipped Thanksgiving. I worked through Christmas, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a stubborn refusal to fail. The night before the final demonstration, I was confident. We had built something strong, and then it crumbled. During the live fire test, with my commanding officer and his entire staff watching, a rival team exploited a single elegant logic flaw I had completely overlooked. The system collapsed in on itself. The silence in the command room was deafening. My immediate superior, a major who had always seemed to resent my presence, reprimanded me harshly in front of everyone. The humiliation was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. That night, feeling smaller and more broken than I ever had, I called home. I don't know what I was looking for, pity maybe, or just a single kind word. Ethan answered. I tried to explain what happened, my voice cracking. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "See, I told you so," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The real world is tough, little sister. It's not like one of your army games. Why don't you just quit? I can probably get you a desk job here, filing papers or something." The line went dead in my heart long before I hung up the phone. A desk job, filing papers. The sheer contempt in his voice was the final nail. I sat on the edge of my military-grade bed in my empty, sterile room, the silence pressing in on me. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced my resolve. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had made a terrible mistake. It was in that moment of absolute darkness that I got a summons to see the base commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne. I walked into his office expecting another lecture, another mark against my record. But he didn't look angry. He simply pointed to a large whiteboard behind his desk. On it, I had frantically sketched out a complex diagram, my after-action analysis, a blueprint for how to fix the flaw and make the system even stronger. He looked at the board, then at me. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice calm and deep. Most people, after a public failure like that, would be focused on excuses. They'd be hiding. You stayed up all night to find a solution. He tapped the diagram with his finger. "What you've drawn here, this is more innovative than the original design. I don't see a failure, Sullivan. I see a strategic mind at work." For the first time in my entire life, someone didn't just see my mistake. They saw my effort. They saw my potential. It was a single sentence from a man who barely knew me, but it was the lifeline I desperately needed. Colonel Thorne then quoted something I'd never forget, from an old Theodore Roosevelt speech. He said, "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." That one conversation, that one moment of recognition, was the spark that reignited everything. The forge inside me, which had grown cold with doubt, roared back to life, hotter and stronger than ever before. The forge inside me had been reignited by Colonel Thorne's words. But an engine needs more than just a spark. It needs fuel. I had spent years running on the fumes of resentment and a desperate need to prove my family wrong. But that was a lonely, corrosive fuel. What happened next taught me that there was a different, cleaner source of energy. The quiet, steady warmth of a chosen family. My relationship with then Colonel Thorne grew beyond that of a commander and his subordinate. He became my mentor. He saw the raw talent I had for strategy, but knew it was useless without the polish of political savvy. He taught me how to navigate the minefield of Pentagon bureaucracy, how to frame a complex technical argument in a way that even a four-star general with no cyber background could understand. He showed me how to be heard. When I was promoted to captain, it was his hands that pinned the 2 silver bars onto my shoulders. The pride in his eyes felt more genuine than any I had ever seen in my own father's. After the ceremony, he didn't just offer a clipped "congratulations." He said, "My wife Helen is making her famous BBQ ribs tonight. You should come over." I was hesitant, unused to such casual kindness, but I went. His home was modest, comfortable, filled with the scent of slow-cooked meat and freshly cut grass. The moment I walked in, Helen, a woman with a smile that could melt glaciers, wrapped me in a warm hug. "So you're Amber," she said, her voice full of genuine delight. "Marcus talks about you all the time. Welcome, welcome to our family." I think I stopped breathing for a second. Family. The word, offered so freely, so warmly, struck a chord deep inside me I didn't know existed. We ate on their back porch, the Georgia twilight settling around us. The dinner was simple, just ribs, potato salad, and coleslaw. But sitting at that patio table, laughing at the Colonel's old war stories, I felt a sense of belonging that 1,000 of my mother's perfectly set Thanksgiving tables could never provide. It was a bittersweet ache. The joy of being accepted mingled with the sad realization of what I had been missing my entire life. That sense of a new family solidified during a tour of duty in Germany at Ramstein Air Base. I was working with a multinational NATO task force, and as my first Christmas away from the States approached, a familiar sense of dread began to creep in. I pictured myself alone in my small apartment, while back in Texas, my family would be gathered, exchanging gifts, continuing their lives as if I were on a different planet. But I wasn't alone. My team, a motley crew of American, British, and Italian officers, refused to let anyone spend the holiday by themselves. They organized a potluck dinner. The Italian major brought a massive bubbling lasagna his mother had taught him to make. The British captain contributed a shepherd's pie, hearty and comforting. I, in turn, baked a Texas pecan pie, a little piece of my complicated home. We crowded into someone's living room, decorated a lopsided Christmas tree with makeshift ornaments, and exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. We talked and laughed, sharing stories of our families and traditions back home. Looking around at those faces, these strangers who had become my brothers and sisters in arms, I understood. Family wasn't just blood, it was shared hardship. It was watching each other's back. It was showing up. It was this newfound strength, this sense of being anchored, that allowed me to say yes to the most pivotal call of my career. By then, Marcus Thorne was a brigadier general. He called me personally. "Amber," he said, his voice serious, "there's an opportunity, a direct commission to full colonel. It's a big jump, but the mission is critical. It's called Project Cerberus." My blood ran cold. Aegis Dynamics, my father, my brother. General Thorne seemed to sense my hesitation. "Listen to me," he said, and his tone was no longer that of a general, but of a father. "I know the situation. The partner is Aegis Dynamics. I know the personal connection. If this is too much, if you feel it compromises you in any way, you can say no. I can assign it to someone else, no questions asked." I was silent for a long moment, letting his words sink in. He was giving me a choice. He was offering me a level of respect and consideration that my own father had never conceived of. He saw me, not my last name, not my potential use to him. He saw a human being with a complicated history and was protecting me. That single act of respect was the final piece of armor I needed. "No, General," I said, and my voice was clear and steady, without a trace of doubt. "I'll take the assignment." A smile entered his voice. "I thought you might." "It's time," I added, more to myself than to him. It was time to stop being the girl in the museum and to start being the woman I had become. After the call with General Thorne, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I had my mission. I had my purpose. I was no longer a daughter trying to earn her father's approval. I was a colonel in the United States Army, entrusted with a vital national security project. For a few blissful days, the ghosts of my family receded. The warmth of my chosen family, the thorns and my brothers and sisters in arms, was a shield. But the past has a long shadow, and it wasn't long before it reached out to pull me back in. The first volley came from my mother. Her number flashed on my screen a week before my scheduled flight to Texas. I answered, expecting the usual brief logistical questions. Instead, I was met with a voice I hadn't heard in years. A syrupy, overly sweet tone she reserved for church friends and important business contacts. "Amber, darling," she began, the endearment so foreign it felt sharp. "I was just telling your aunt how wonderfully you're doing. We heard you're working on a very big project now. We are all so incredibly proud of you." A cold dread trickled down my spine. Proud. That word had never been in her vocabulary when describing me. I knew instantly this wasn't a call, it was a maneuver. She didn't wait for me to respond. "You know, your brother Ethan is under a little pressure with his new assignment. It's a lot for one person to handle. You're his big sister, Amber. I know you'll help him out however you can." After all, she added, her voice dropping into a tone of gentle guilt, "we're family, and family helps each other." Her words were a silken web, each strand woven with the unspoken obligation of a family that only remembered I existed when I could be of use. The family that was never there for my promotions, my hardships, or my moments of fear. I kept my voice flat, professional, the voice of a soldier, not a daughter. "Work is work, Mom," I said, the words feeling like ice in my mouth. "I'll do what's required by the mission." The silence on her end was telling. I had failed to take the bait. The second volley came a few days later, this time directly from Ethan. It wasn't a call, but an email. The subject line read, "Re-Project Cerberus." There was no "Hey sis," no "Hope you're doing well." It was all business. The body of the email was a blunt, arrogant list of technical suggestions, and more disturbingly, a list of preferred subcontractors. "I know you're the new liaison," he wrote, "so I'm sending this over to get you up to speed. These subs are all longtime partners of Dad's solid Texas companies. All you really need to do is rubber stamp this list when it comes across your desk. It'll make things go a lot smoother for everyone." I stared at the screen, a mixture of disgust and cold fury rising in me. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He saw me not as a colonel, not as a professional with a duty to the American taxpayer, but as his inside man at the Pentagon, a tool, a pawn in his and my father's corporate game. I pictured him typing it, a smug look on his face, so certain of his power, so sure of my compliance. I closed my laptop without replying, my hands clenched into tight fists. The final decisive attack came the night before I was due to fly home for Thanksgiving. It was my father. His voice on the phone was the one I knew best, the voice of command, the voice that expected and received absolute obedience. "Amber," he started, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantry, "I hear you're overseeing Ethan's project. Good." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Now you listen to me. You carry the Sullivan name. Every decision you make in that position reflects on this family and on Aegis Dynamics. I don't want any foolishness from you, no rocking the boat. Your job is to make sure Ethan's project is a success, and that he looks good in front of David Chen. I don't want to hear a single complaint." It wasn't advice. It wasn't a request. It was a direct order from the CEO of his own little kingdom. He was trying to put me back in the box he'd built for me my entire life, the box of the compliant, second-best daughter who existed to support the ambitions of the men in her family. That single phone call vaporized any lingering foolish hope I had that things might have changed. They hadn't changed at all. They had just recalibrated their strategy. They didn't see me, the daughter, the soldier, the woman I had become. They only saw my rank. They saw a tool, a lever of power they could pull for their own benefit. And in that cold, stark moment, I knew that the homecoming they were expecting was not the one they were going to get. The oppressive weight of my family's expectations settled over the living room as the remnants of the Thanksgiving feast grew cold in the kitchen. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of disappointment and disdain. After the toast, after my mother's whispered blame, a part of me, a foolish, stubborn part that refused to die, still wanted to try one last time. It was a final, desperate attempt to bridge the canyon that separated our worlds. I went upstairs, my steps heavy on the familiar stairs, and retrieved the gift I had so carefully carried all the way from my duty station, wrapped in protective tissue paper. I came back down and stood before my father. He was back in his leather throne, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I waited until a commercial break in the game. In my hands I held a shadow box, its wooden frame polished to a deep, respectful cherry finish. Inside, perfectly folded by a fellow soldier into a tight, crisp triangle, was an American flag. A certificate of authenticity was nestled beside it. "Dad," I said, my voice quiet but steady, cutting through the jingle of a car commercial. "This is for you. This is the flag that flew over my command post in Afghanistan for my entire tour. It flew through 120-degree heat and freezing desert nights. It was there during every patrol I went on. It's been officially retired, and I wanted you to have it. For a soldier, this is one of the highest honors you can bestow upon a civilian. This flag wasn't just cloth and thread, it was a testament. It had witnessed hardship, courage, and loss. It had been a silent sentinel through rocket attacks and sandstorms that scoured the landscape bare. It was a piece of my soul, a tangible symbol of my service, my sacrifice, and the country I had sworn to protect. It represented a part of my life he had never once asked about. My father looked at the box. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even lean forward. He simply stared at it, a flicker of something unreadable. Was it confusion, annoyance, in his eyes before it was replaced by cold, dismissive pragmatism? "And what am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his tone flat and genuinely perplexed. "Where would I even hang it?" "Amber," he said, shaking his head slightly as if dealing with a child. "Aegis just closed a $100 million deal with the Saudis. We have the signed contract. That's the kind of thing you frame and hang on a wall." He waved a hand, a gesture of finality, of utter rejection. He turned away, his attention already back on the television, dismissing the flag, my service, and me, all in one swift, effortless motion. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. My throat closed up, a knot of pure, suffocating hurt lodging itself there. I felt the heat rise in my face, a blush of shame and anger so intense it felt like a physical burn. Seeing his opening, Ethan pounced. He sauntered over from the kitchen, holding a piece of pecan pie, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Oh, come on, Amber, lighten up," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension as he took a large bite of pie. "What does a dusty old flag even mean, really? Do you have any idea how many points Aegis stock went up after I was named project lead? That's real value. That's tangible." He set his plate down and leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, ensuring only I could hear the full venom of his words. You risk your life for a few bronze medals and a folded-up piece of cloth. I make a few phone calls and generate millions of dollars for this family. So you'd better know your place in that meeting tomorrow. Don't you dare screw this up for me." I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I simply looked from Ethan's smug face, a speck of whipped cream at the corner of his mouth, to my father's indifferent back. I gave them a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture they completely misinterpreted as acquiescence. Then I turned, holding the shadow box tight against my chest like a shield, and walked back up the stairs. The pain was too deep for tears. It had flash frozen into something else, something hard and cold and sharp. Everyone has a line, a boundary of respect so fundamental that when it's crossed, something inside you breaks for good. It isn't just about a disagreement or a harsh word. It's the moment you realize that the values you'd literally die for are, to them, a joke. It's the moment your greatest sacrifice is weighed against their smallest convenience and found to be worthless. I'd be honored to hear about your line in the comments, that single moment that changed everything for you. Because for me, that was it. That was the line. They had just declared themselves the enemy of everything I stood for. I entered my old room and gently placed the shadow box on the desk. For a long moment, I just looked at it. The stars and stripes, a symbol of a promise I intended to keep. The hurt was still there, a dull, throbbing ache, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, terrifying clarity. The rules of engagement had just changed. They wanted to play a game of business. Fine. I would show them a game of strategy. I would show them a war fought not with bullets, but with facts, with logic, and with the full weight of the United States Department of Defense. I sat down, my back straight, my movements precise. I took out my government-issued, encrypted laptop, the fan whirring to life in the silent room. It was time to draft my operations plan. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. That night, my childhood bedroom, with its faded floral wallpaper and cheerleading trophies, transformed into a tactical operations center. The pain and anger from downstairs were compartmentalized, packed away into a hardened steel box in my mind. The mission was all that mattered now. The girl who had cried in the rain over an empty chair was gone. In her place was a colonel with a problem to solve. My process was methodical, ingrained from years of training. I engaged the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act, observe. I opened my encrypted laptop and pulled up the preliminary plan Ethan had so arrogantly emailed me. I didn't just read it, I dissected it. Line by line, I stripped it down to its core components, mapping out its architecture, its protocols, and its dependencies. The document was an exercise in corporate hubris, slickly designed, full of impressive-sounding buzzwords, but fundamentally weak. Orient. With the data laid out before me, I began to connect the dots. The weaknesses weren't random errors, they formed a pattern. I traced them back to their source, and it became chillingly clear. The plan was built not on sound security principles, but on cronyism. He had prioritized subcontractors who were old golfing buddies of my father, not companies with proven expertise in cybersecurity. The firewalls were outdated because the preferred vendor offered a better profit margin. The encryption standards were subpar because the recommended consultant was my uncle's brother-in-law. This wasn't just a bad plan, it was a house of cards built on nepotism, designed to enrich family friends at the expense of national security. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was astounding. They thought I was a rubber stamp. They thought I was one of them. Decide? My course of action became crystal clear. I wasn't going into that meeting to humiliate my brother. I was going in to protect the integrity of a $1.2 billion defense project. My objective was not familial revenge, it was mission success. I spent the next several hours forging my weapons. I didn't write a speech. I compiled a list of questions. Each one was a scalpel, designed to precisely cut through the jargon and expose the fatal flaw beneath. Can you explain the decision to use the X2500 series firewall when it has a known vulnerability to side-channel attacks, a vulnerability that was widely publicized 6 months ago? The proposal relies heavily on a subcontractor, Texan Solutions, whose primary experience is in commercial IT, not hardened military networks. What is their specific qualification for handling classified data streams? The data redundancy plan appears to have a single point of failure. How do you justify this in a Tier 1 national security project? Each question was a loaded weapon, and I knew the answers, or lack thereof, before I even asked. Just as the first hint of gray light began to silhouette the cotton fields outside my window, I made a final strategic move. I initiated a secure, encrypted call to General Thorne. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and clear, even at this early hour. "General, this is Colonel Sullivan." I kept my voice formal, direct. "I have completed my initial assessment of the Project Cerberus proposal. It is critically flawed. I am requesting full discretionary authority in the 9 a.m. meeting, up to and including the authority to recommend an immediate halt to the project pending a full review." The silence on the line stretched for a long moment. I could hear him breathing, considering the weight of my request. He wasn't just my mentor now, he was my commanding general, and I was asking for the power to potentially derail a billion-dollar contract and cause a major political headache. Then his voice came back, firm and unwavering. "Colonel Sullivan, I put you on this assignment because I trust your judgment, not your last name. You have full authority. Do what you have to do to protect the interests of the United States Army." Full authority. Those 2 words were the final piece of my armor. The knowledge that I was not alone, that my command had my back, solidified my resolve into something unbreakable. An hour later, I stood in the bathroom, the steam from the hot shower clearing from the mirror. I began the ritual. The crisp, dark blue skirt and jacket of the Army service uniform, the perfectly knotted tie, the rows of ribbons on my chest, each one a silent story of a place I had been, a job I had done. The brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and last, the single most important pieces, the silver eagles of a full colonel, pinned precisely on each shoulder. I looked at my reflection. The tired, hurt girl from the night before was gone. The woman staring back at me was not a Sullivan. She was a commander. Her eyes were clear, her posture was straight, and her purpose was absolute. My father and brother were about to have a meeting with their daughter. But the person who was about to walk into their boardroom was Colonel Sullivan of the United States Army, and she was coming to do her job. The drive from Lubbock to Austin was 5 hours of focused silence. I didn't listen to music. I didn't think about the past. I rehearsed my questions, my strategy, my endgame. I was no longer a daughter driving to a family confrontation. I was a commander moving toward her objective. The Aegis Dynamics campus in Austin was a gleaming monument to modern corporate power. Glass and steel towered over manicured lawns, a world away from the dusty plains I called home. This was the heart of the Silicon Hills, a place where ambition was the currency and results were the only language spoken. I felt a surge of cold confidence. This was a language I could speak. I pulled into the visitor parking and stepped out of my truck. As I walked toward the main entrance, the polished glass doors reflected a woman I almost didn't recognize. The Army service uniform, with its sharp lines and stark colors, was a suit of armor that changed the way I walked, the way I held my head. It was a visible proclamation of who I was. The moment I stepped inside the vast marble-floored lobby, the atmosphere shifted. The security guards at the main desk, both former Marines by the look of their posture and haircuts, saw me. Their casual chatter stopped. They straightened up, their eyes instinctively flicking to the silver eagles on my shoulders. One of them, a man with sergeant stripes tattooed on his forearm, immediately came around the desk. "Good morning, Colonel," he said, his voice crisp and respectful. "We've been expecting you. You're cleared for the executive floor." He escorted me to a private elevator, badging me through security, with a deference my own family had never shown me. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive suite. And there he was. My brother, Ethan, was laughing with a colleague, a cup of coffee in his hand. He turned as the doors opened, his laugh catching in his throat. "Amber," he stammered, his eyes widening. His gaze dropped from my face to my uniform, then locked onto the eagles on my shoulders. The color drained from his face. The casual arrogance he wore like a second skin evaporated, replaced by raw, naked panic. What are you doing here, in that?" Before I could answer, my father, Robert Sullivan, strode out of a nearby office, flanked by two other vice presidents. He was in his element, the powerful executive, until he saw me. He stopped dead. His jaw went slack. The confident stride faltered. All the blood seemed to rush from his head, leaving his face a pasty, sickly white. "Colonel?" one of the VPs with him asked, his eyes lighting up with professional recognition as he stepped forward. "It's an honor to have you here in person. We weren't expecting you on site." My father could only whisper the word, a strangled sound of disbelief. "Colonel," I gave a single professional nod to the vice president, ignoring the personal chaos erupting around me. "It's good to be here." I walked past my stunned father and my shell-shocked brother and entered the boardroom, leaving a trail of silent, frantic confusion in my wake. I chose a seat at the head of the long, polished table, directly opposite the CEO's chair. My father and brother stumbled in after me, their faces masks of bewilderment. They chose seats at the far end of the table, as far away from me as possible, looking small and utterly out of place. At precisely 9 a.m., the CEO, David Chen, entered. He was a dynamic, respected leader, known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude. His eyes scanned the room, noted the tension, and then landed on me. A smile of genuine, surprised pleasure broke across his face. He walked directly to me, extending his hand. "Colonel Sullivan," he said warmly, his handshake firm. "This is a welcome surprise. I was under the impression our meeting would be via video conference." I rose to meet his handshake. "I felt a project of this importance warranted a personal visit, Mr. Chen." He beamed, then turned to the room, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "For those of you who have not been properly briefed," he announced, his gaze sweeping over my father and brother. "This is Colonel Amber Sullivan. She is the Pentagon's lead liaison and oversight officer for Project Cerberus. She will have final approval on all technical specifications, milestones, and deliverables." You could have heard a pin drop. The air was sucked out of the room. I could see my father physically sink into his chair, his face ashen. Ethan stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if I were an alien who had just landed. The meeting began. Team leads presented their sections, their presentations directed as much to me as to Mr. Chen. The room was a masterclass in corporate power dynamics. When the engineering lead spoke, he addressed his technical queries to me. When the budget director presented, she looked to me for confirmation on spending allocations. I fielded their questions with a calm, precise clarity, demonstrating a depth of knowledge that left no room for doubt. I wasn't just a liaison, I was in command. Then it was Ethan's turn. The cocksure, confident son of the boss was gone. In his place was a nervous, sweating man who couldn't seem to make eye contact with anyone. He fumbled with his slides. He stumbled over his own talking points, his voice a pale imitation of its usual booming arrogance. He was clearly and completely unnerved by my presence, by the authority I radiated from the other end of the table. When he finally finished his rambling presentation, there was a polite, awkward silence. I let it hang in the air for a moment before I spoke, my voice cold, clear, and devoid of any emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," I said, using his last name deliberately. "I have a few questions. Your plan calls for the use of the X2500 series firewall. Are you aware that this model has a known, well-publicized vulnerability to side-channel attacks?" Ethan blinked. Our vendor assured us." I cut him off. "Your vendor is incorrect. Second, your data redundancy plan has a catastrophic single point of failure. How do you justify this in a Tier 1 national security project?" We felt the risk was manageable. "The Pentagon does not find it manageable," I stated flatly. "Third, your primary subcontractor for data encryption has no prior experience with classified military networks. On what basis were they selected?" He had no answer. He just stared at me, his face turning a blotchy red. I let the silence sit for another beat. Then I delivered the final blow. I looked not at him, but at David Chen. "The proposal as it stands is unacceptable. It demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the security requirements for a project of this nature." I turned my gaze back to my brother. "On behalf of the Department of Defense, I am officially pausing the deployment of Phase 1. You will submit a revised comprehensive plan addressing these deficiencies by UY 900 hours this Friday. This meeting is over." I stood up. The entire room was frozen in stunned silence. The game was over. The board had been flipped. The invisible daughter, the family disappointment, had just checkmated the king. I didn't stay in the boardroom to savor the victory. There was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of a necessary duty performed. As the other executives filed out, their faces a mixture of shock and newfound respect, I gathered my notes. Before I could leave, my father's assistant appeared at the door, her expression apologetic. "Colonel Sullivan, your father is requesting your presence in his office. Your mother is here as well." The aftershock. I had anticipated it. I walked down the plushly carpeted hallway to the corner office, the one with the panoramic view of the Austin skyline. The door was ajar. Inside, the scene was a tableau of defeat. My mother was sitting on a leather sofa, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Ethan was slumped in a chair, staring at the floor, the picture of a deflated ego. And my father was pacing back and forth, in front of his massive mahogany desk, a caged tiger whose territory had just been invaded. He stopped pacing as I entered, his face a chaotic storm of anger and fear. "Why?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "Why would you do this to us? Humiliate your own brother, your own family, in front of the entire company?" I stood my ground in the center of the room. my posture unchanged from the boardroom. I looked him directly in the eye, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake. I didn't do anything to you, Dad. I did my job, the job you and Mom and Ethan have dismissed as a little game for the last decade. This was never a family matter. This is a matter of national security. The phrase national security hung in the air, a concept so foreign to the insulated world of this office that it seemed to suck the oxygen out. My mother let out a sob. "We didn't know, Amber," she wept, her voice pleading. "We didn't know you were so important." And there it was, the confession at the heart of it all. It wasn't an apology for the years of neglect, for the missed promotions, for the dismissal of my life's work. It was an apology for underestimating my power. Their regret wasn't born of love, it was born of fear. Ethan finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words sounding like they were being dragged from him. "What I saw in there today—" I cut him off, my voice sharp and precise. "Your apology is not owed to me, Ethan. It's owed to the Pentagon for submitting a proposal that was negligent at best. Fix it." I then turned my attention back to my father. "And you were worried people would think you used your influence to get me this assignment. You should be more worried about the opposite. I have built my entire career, brick by painful brick, completely independent of this family and this company, for this exact reason. I owe the Sullivans nothing. General Thorne assigned me this mission because of my expertise, and my expertise alone." My father seemed to deflate, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a bewildered, aging man. He made one last attempt to reclaim control, to put me back in my place. "Regardless of all this," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading, "you are still my daughter." For the first time, a sad, weary smile touched my lips. I shook my head slowly. "In this building, Dad, in this context, I am Colonel Sullivan of the United States Army. That is who you are dealing with." I took a breath, and then I drew the line, not in sand, but in solid rock. And from this day forward, any relationship we have, personal or professional, will be based on respect. Not on blood, not on obligation, on mutual respect. If you can't give me that, then we have nothing left to talk about. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving a stunned, absolute silence in my wake. I didn't look back. I walked down the hall, through the lobby where no one dared to meet my eyes, and out into the bright Texas sun. Once I was in my truck, I closed the door and the sound of the world was shut out. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 24 hours drained away in a sudden whooshing rush, leaving me feeling utterly and completely exhausted. I leaned my head back against the seat, my body trembling slightly from the emotional whiplash. There was no triumph, no elation. There was just a vast, quiet emptiness. And in that emptiness, I thought of the old serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I couldn't change who they were, their priorities, their blindness, their conditional love. The courage to change the things I could change how I reacted. I could refuse to be their victim. I could draw a line, and the wisdom to know the difference. I took a long, slow breath, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of their expectations lift from my shoulders. It was a painful, brutal amputation, but I was free. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, the Texas heat felt like a distant memory. My life was now in Arlington, Virginia, in a bright, airy apartment that overlooked the quiet, rolling hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with the massive, formidable Pentagon visible in the distance. The space was a reflection of the woman I had become, not the girl I had been. The walls were minimalist and clean. Instead of faded cheerleading trophies, they held carefully chosen pieces of my life. There was a photo of my NATO team laughing together at that potluck in Germany. There was a large world map, dotted with pins marking the places my service had taken me, from the dust of Afghanistan to the forests of Germany. And in the most prominent place, right across from my front door, hung the shadow box with the American flag. My father had rejected it, but here in my home, it was no longer a symbol of his denial. It was a monument to my own path, a testament to a promise I had kept to myself. The revised proposal for Project Cerberus had been submitted by my brother on time. It was thorough, technically sound, and stripped of all cronyism. I approved it without comment. Our relationship, and my relationship with my father, now existed only in the form of polite, professional emails. As distant and cold as stars in a winter sky, I had accepted that. The quiet ache of what could have been was still there, but it no longer had the power to break me. That evening, the warm air of a Virginia summer night drifted through my open balcony doors. My apartment was filled with laughter and the comfortable murmur of conversation. I was hosting a small get-together, a housewarming of sorts. General Thorne and his wife, Helen, were there, along with a few of the trusted colleagues who had become my truest friends. The food was simple, takeout from a local Thai place, but the feeling was anything but. General Thorne arrived with a gift. It was a framed article from the Army Times, a leading military publication. The headline read, "Project Cerberus, New Cyber Defense Paradigm Succeeds in Initial Trials." The article went on to praise the project, singling out the sharp strategic thinking of one of R.C. Bear's most promising young colonels, Amber Sullivan. He handed it to me, a proud, fatherly smile on his face. "Your legacy isn't in contracts or stock prices, Amber," he said, his voice low and full of meaning. "It's in the security protocols you designed that are now being adopted Army-wide. It's in the young lieutenants you're mentoring. Those are the things that last." His words settled in my heart, not with the fiery validation I once craved, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. He understood. He saw the real value. Later, as darkness fell, we stood on the balcony, glasses of wine in hand, looking out at the Pentagon, a five-sided city of purpose glowing against the night sky. The general raised his glass. "To those who dare to take the road less traveled," he said, looking directly at me. We all raised our glasses. "To the road less traveled," we echoed. As I sipped my wine, I looked at the faces around me, illuminated by the warm light from my living room. Helen, who had welcomed me into her family without a moment's hesitation. The general who had seen my potential through my failure. My colleagues who respected me for my mind, not my name. This was my family, the one I had built, the one I had chosen. My phone buzzed. It was a video call from my parents. I hesitated for a second, then answered. Their faces appeared on the screen, looking older, smaller. They had heard about the article. They offered awkward, stilted congratulations. There was an unspoken plea in their eyes, a desire to reconnect, but they didn't know how. They didn't have the words. The old me would have dissected every syllable, searched for hidden meanings, for a scrap of genuine affection. The new me simply smiled. "Thank you," I said, my voice calm and sincere. "I appreciate you calling. I have guests, so I have to go. I'll talk to you soon." I ended the call before the conversation could falter into uncomfortable silence. I put the phone down and turned back to my friends. I realized, with a clarity that was as peaceful as the night air, that their approval no longer mattered. It wasn't the prize I was fighting for anymore. I raised my glass again, this time for a silent toast of my own. It wasn't in response to the general, it was for me. To Colonel Amber Sullivan, I thought. To the woman who found her peace, not in the forgiveness of others, but in her own unshakable pride. The road had been long and lonely, but for the first time in my life, I was truly home. That night on the balcony wasn't an ending, but a true beginning. My journey to find peace was long, and I want to thank you for walking it with me. I believe everyone has a story of finding their own strength, of choosing their own family, and of defining their own worth on their own terms. The mission of this channel is to be a home for these powerful journeys. By following, you become part of a community that believes no one should feel invisible. Please share your own moments of finding peace in the comments below. Thank you for listening.